On a quiet street corner in downtown Boston, where the morning sun cast long shadows between tall buildings, an elderly man named Mr. Lee had made his temporary home. At 56 years old, his weathered face told stories of countless hardships, yet his gentle brown eyes still sparkled with kindness. Every morning, as the city slowly woke up, Mr. Lee would carefully organize his few possessions, a worn-out backpack, some blankets, and a small plastic container that he treasured more than anything else. Life hadn't always been this way for him. Just 3 years ago, he had a job as a warehouse worker, a small apartment, and dreams of retiring peacefully. But a series of unfortunate events, a workplace injury, mounting medical bills, and the economic downturn had stripped away everything he had worked for. Yet somehow, he managed to maintain his dignity and, more importantly, his compassion. Each morning, Mr. Lee would visit the local coffee shop's dumpster, where Maria, the kind-hearted owner, secretly left yesterday's unsold sandwiches in a clean bag on top. She had noticed how he always shared his food with the stray dogs in the area and was touched by his selfless nature. Mr. Lee would carefully sort through what he found, making sure to save the best pieces for his four-legged friends. It was during one such morning routine that he first met Lucky. The small brown dog had appeared out of nowhere, trembling behind a trash can, looking at him with scared but hopeful eyes. Unlike other strays that would grab food and run, Lucky stayed, watching Mr. Lee intently. Her fur was matted and she was clearly unduffed, but there was something special about her. A gentleness that reminded Mr. Lee of the pet he had to give up when he lost his home. "Hey there, little one," he had said softly, his voice rough from lack of use. "Aren't you hungry?" He pulled out a piece of sandwich and placed it on the ground, then backed away slowly. Lucky approached cautiously, sniffing the air, her tail tucked between her legs. As she ate, Mr. Lee noticed she had a slight limp and what looked like old scars on her legs. That first meeting turned into a daily ritual. Every morning, Lucky would appear just as Mr. Lee finished collecting food. She began to trust him more with each passing day, eventually letting him pat her head while she ate. Mr. Lee found himself saving the best portions of food for her, sometimes going hungry himself to ensure she had enough to eat. Other people on the street began to notice this unusual friendship. The morning rush hour crowd would slow down to watch the homeless man sharing his meager resources with a stray dog. Some started leaving extra food near Mr. Lee's spot, a sandwich here, some dog biscuits there. A local shopkeeper even put out a bowl of water every morning. As weeks passed, Lucky started bringing other stray dogs to their morning meetings. First, it was just one, a scraggly white puppy with a black patch over one eye. Then came another and another. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, Mr. Lee's heart swelled with joy. He now had a purpose, a family of sorts, even if they were all displaced souls like himself. He developed a system, learning each dog's personality and needs. Some were shy and needed space, others craved attention more than food. He gave them all names, not fancy ones, but simple names that suited their personalities. The white puppy became Patch, an old golden retriever mix was Sunshine, and a tiny terrier with endless energy was Spark. What amazed passers-by most wasn't just that Mr. Lee shared his food, but how he talked to the dogs. He would tell them stories, give them gentle encouragement, and somehow manage to keep peace among the pack. Even on the coldest mornings or during heavy rain, he would be there, making sure his furry friends were fed. The local community began to take notice. Children would stop by with their parents to watch the morning feeding ritual. Some would bring their pocket money to contribute to what they called Mr. Lee's Dog Family. The elderly man would always thank them with a bright smile and make sure they saw how their contributions helped the hungry animals. One particularly cold morning, as Mr. Lee was distributing food among his growing family of strays, he noticed Lucky wasn't eating as enthusiastically as usual. She seemed to be favoring her right front paw more than normal, and there was a concerning sadness in her eyes. Little did Mr. Lee know that this observation would lead to a series of events that would change not only his life, but the lives of countless other homeless animals and people in the community. The next part of this story would reveal how Mr. Lee's concern for Lucky would set in motion an extraordinary chain of events, but for now, he simply sat beside her, gently stroking her fur and sharing his warmth on that cold Boston morning. His own struggles momentarily forgotten, he whispered softly to her, "Don't worry, girl. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. The morning after Mr. Lee noticed Lucky's concerning behavior, he woke up earlier than usual. His bones ached from sleeping on the hard concrete, but his worry for Lucky pushed him to move quickly. The street was quiet except for the occasional rumble of early delivery trucks, and the air was crisp with the promise of another cold day. As he organized his usual morning routine, Mr. Lee couldn't shake off his concern. Over the past few months, his small family of strays had grown to include 7 regular visitors, each with their own personality and story. There was Patch, the playful white puppy who always tried to steal extra treats. Sunshine, the elderly golden retriever who moved slowly but showed endless patience with the younger dogs. Spark, the tiny terrier who bounced around like he had springs in his paws. Cookie, a spotted mutt who always waited politely for her turn. Shadow, a shy black dog who kept his distance but never missed a meal. And finally, Whiskers, a scruffy gray dog who had recently joined their morning gatherings. But Lucky was special. She was the first one who had trusted him, who had shown him that even in his darkest times, he could still make a difference in someone's life. Now, watching her struggle with what seemed to be a worsening injury, Mr. Lee felt helpless. His morning food collection routine had evolved over time. Maria from the coffee shop now left him not just sandwiches, but also proper dog food that customers would donate. The bakery down the street, run by old Mr. Chen, started leaving day-old bread and pastries in a clean box with Mr. Lee's name on it. Even the small grocery store began contributing vegetables and meat that were still good but couldn't be sold. As Mr. Lee arranged the food that morning, he noticed more people than usual stopping to help. Mrs. Kim, who ran the flower shop, brought a bag of rice and some leftover chicken from her family's dinner. A young office worker who passed by every day dropped off some dog treats he bought specially. A school bus driver named Tom would park his bus early just to watch the morning feeding ritual, often bringing water bottles and paper bowls. But today was different. As the dogs started gathering, Lucky was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Lee waited, his heart growing heavier with each passing minute. The other dogs seemed to sense his worry, staying closer to him than usual. Even Patch, normally the most energetic of the bunch, sat quietly by his side. Just as he was about to go looking for her, Lucky appeared from around the corner. She was moving very slowly, barely putting any weight on her right front paw. What worried Mr. Lee most was the visible wound he could now see on her leg. It was swollen and seemed to be infected. The regular morning crowd that had gathered to watch the feeding noticed something was wrong too. A young woman who worked at the nearby dental office approached Mr. Lee. Her name was Dr. Rose, and she had been bringing coffee to him every morning for the past month. "That looks really bad," she said, kneeling down to get a better look at Lucky's leg. "She needs medical attention." Mr. Lee nodded, his voice thick with worry. "I know, but I don't have any money for a vet." Dr. Rose pulled out her phone. "I know someone who might be able to help. My sister volunteers at a pet rescue organization. Let me make a call." As she stepped away to make the phone call, Mr. Lee sat down beside Lucky, gently stroking her fur. The other dogs gathered around them, creating a protective circle. Even Shadow, usually the most distant, came closer than ever before. The morning crowd had grown larger than usual, with many regular passers-by stopping to check on Lucky. Someone brought a clean towel to make her more comfortable. Another person offered their unopened water bottle to clean her wound. A child emptied his piggy bank into Mr. Lee's cup, insisting it was for Lucky's medicine. Dr. Rose returned with good news. Her sister's organization had agreed to take Lucky to their vet immediately. But there was a problem. The rescue center was on the other side of the city, and Lucky couldn't walk that far. Without hesitation, Tom, the school bus driver, spoke up. "My shift doesn't start for another hour. I can drive you there." Mr. Lee was overwhelmed by the offer, but hesitated. "What about the others?" he asked, looking at the remaining dogs. Mrs. Kim stepped forward. "We'll take care of them while you're gone. They're part of our community too." And she was right. Over the months, these morning gatherings had become more than just a homeless man feeding stray dogs. They had become a symbol of compassion that brought out the best in everyone who witnessed it. As Mr. Lee carefully picked up Lucky, mindful of her injured leg, he realized something extraordinary had happened. His small act of kindness, sharing what little he had with a stray dog, had created a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood. People who would normally rush past each other without a glance were now working together, helping not just the dogs, but each other. The morning sun was fully up now, casting a warm glow over the scene. Mr. Lee held Lucky close as he climbed into Tom's car, his heart full of hope. The other dogs watched from the sidewalk, surrounded by their newfound human guardians. What had started as one man's compassion had grown into something much bigger, a community united by kindness. As they drove away, Mr. Lee couldn't know that this moment would mark the beginning of an even bigger change in his life. But for now, all that mattered was getting Lucky the help she needed and knowing that his other four-legged friends were in good hands. The ride to the veterinary clinic felt like the longest journey of Mr. Lee's life. Every bump in the road made Lucky whimper softly, and each time she did, he felt his heart break a little more. Tom, the kind bus driver, took extra care to drive slowly and avoid potholes, constantly checking his rearview mirror to make sure his passengers were okay. As they drove through the city streets, Mr. Lee couldn't help but think about how much his life had changed since Lucky first appeared. Before her, his days had been empty, marked only by the struggle to survive. Now, despite still being homeless, he had a purpose, a family of sorts, and a community that cared. The veterinary clinic was bigger than Mr. Lee had imagined. Clean white walls and the smell of antiseptic greeted them as they walked through the automatic doors. Lucky trembled in his arms, either from pain or fear, probably both. The reception area was busy with people and their pets, but something remarkable happened when they entered. Perhaps it was Mr. Lee's weathered appearance, or maybe it was the obvious distress of the dog in his arms, but people immediately made way for them. A receptionist with kind eyes and graying hair quickly approached them. Her name tag read Mrs. Chen, and she took one look at Lucky's condition before springing into action. "Dr. Rose's sister called ahead about you," she said warmly. "Let's get this sweet girl checked out right away." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Lucky was taken to an examination room where a young veterinarian, Dr. Park, carefully cleaned and examined her wound. Mr. Lee refused to leave Lucky's side, and to his surprise, no one asked him to. Instead, they worked around him, explaining each step of their examination. "The infection is quite serious," Dr. Park explained, gently probing the swollen area. "But what's really interesting is that while we were checking her over, we'd found something else." She reached for a small handheld device and ran it over Lucky's shoulder area. It beeped. "She has a microchip." Mr. Lee's heart sank. He had grown to love Lucky, and the thought that she might belong to someone else was painful. But he knew that if she had a family out there missing her, they deserved to know she was safe. The clinic staff quickly got to work tracking down the microchip information. Meanwhile, Lucky needed immediate treatment for her infection. Dr. Park explained that she would need surgery to clean the wound properly and would have to stay at the clinic for at least a few days. Mr. Lee sat in the waiting room while Lucky was in surgery, his hands clasped tightly together. Tom had to leave for his bus route, but not before pressing some money into Mr. Lee's hand. For Lucky's treatment, he said simply, waving away any attempts to refuse. As the hours passed, more people from the neighborhood began showing up at the clinic. Mrs. Kim arrived with a thermos of hot soup and a paper bag containing fresh bread. Dr. Rose stopped by during her lunch break, bringing coffee and staying to keep Mr. Lee company. Even Mr. Chen from the bakery came by, carrying a box of pastries for the clinic staff. Late in the afternoon, while Lucky was still in recovery, a woman rushed into the clinic. She introduced herself as Mrs. John, the founder of a local pet rescue organization. She looked tired but hopeful as she explained that Lucky's microchip had led them to her organization. The story she told left everyone in the waiting room amazed. Lucky had been one of their rescue dogs, saved from a neglectful situation over a year ago. She had been rehabilitated and was about to be adopted when she escaped during a thunderstorm. They had searched for months but eventually had to accept that she might be gone forever. As Mrs. John listened to Mr. Lee's story about how he had been feeding and caring for Lucky and other strays, tears welled up in her eyes. "For months we worried about whether she was safe, whether she was being cared for," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And all this time, she had found someone who loved her just as much as we did." The clinic staff brought updates about Lucky's surgery. It had been successful, and she was recovering well. When they finally allowed Mr. Lee to see her, he found her sleeping peacefully, her injured leg bandaged and an IV providing her with much-needed antibiotics. Mrs. Zhang stayed with Mr. Lee, asking him questions about the other strays he cared for. She was particularly interested in his morning feeding routine and how he had managed to create such a strong community around his efforts to help the dogs. As the evening approached, Mrs. Zhang made an unexpected proposal. "We've been looking for someone to help with our most challenging rescue cases," she said. "Someone who understands street dogs, who has patience and compassion. Would you be interested in working with us?" Mr. Lee was stunned. "But I'm homeless," he said quietly. "I don't have any formal training." Mrs. Zhang smiled. "You have something more valuable, experience and a genuine love for these animals. We have a small apartment above our rescue center where our night caretaker usually stays. It's currently empty. The position could be yours, if you want it." The offer seemed too good to be true. Mr. Lee looked at Lucky, peacefully sleeping on her hospital bed, then back at Mrs. Zhang. "What about my other dogs? The ones I'd feed every morning?" "We'll help them too," she assured him. "Together, we can work out a proper feeding program, get them medical care, and maybe even find homes for those who are ready." As Mr. Lee sat there, processing this incredible turn of events, he realized that Lucky had lived up to her name in more ways than one. She hadn't just been lucky to find him, he had been lucky to find her. Through helping her, he had discovered a community's capacity for kindness, and now, potentially, a way forward from homelessness. Outside the clinic windows, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It seemed fitting. This day that had started with such worry was ending with hope. Mr. Lee didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, he was excited to find out. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Lucky remained at the veterinary clinic, recovering steadily under the watchful eyes of Dr. Park and the medical team. Mr. Lee visited her twice daily, spending hours sitting beside her bed, talking to her softly about all the changes happening in their lives. During one of these visits, Mrs. Zhang brought over paperwork for his new position at the rescue center. Mr. Lee hadn't filled out job applications in years, and his hands shook slightly as he held the pen. But Mrs. Zhang was patient, helping him through each section, explaining everything clearly. "The position comes with health insurance," she mentioned casually, though her eyes showed she understood the significance of this detail. Mr. Lee had to turn away for a moment, overwhelmed by this simple but life-changing benefit. It had been years since he'd been able to see a doctor for his own aching joints and dental problems. Meanwhile, the morning feeding routine for the other dogs continued, but with some remarkable changes. The community that had formed around Mr. Lee's daily act of kindness had taken on a life of its own. Mrs. Kim and Mr. Chen coordinated with other local business owners to ensure the dogs would still be fed. Dr. Rose started a social media group to organize volunteers and donations. Tom, the bus driver, brought his teenage daughter to help one morning. She had a talent for photography and took pictures of each dog, which would help with finding them homes later. Patch, the playful white puppy, was particularly photogenic, always tilting his head curiously at the camera. The day Mr. Lee moved into the small apartment above the rescue center was emotional in ways he hadn't expected. His worldly possessions fit into one backpack, yet somehow he felt rich. The apartment was simple but clean, with a real bed, a small kitchen, and a bathroom of his own. There was even a window that overlooked the rescue center's exercise yard. Mrs. Zhang had arranged for some basics: towels, sheets, toiletries, and even a few changes of clothes that had been donated. But what touched Mr. Lee most was finding a framed photograph on the bedside table. It was a picture of him with Lucky and the other strays, taken by Tom's daughter during one of their morning feeding sessions. His first week of work was both challenging and rewarding. The rescue center was much larger than he'd imagined, with separate areas for dogs with different needs. Some were recovering from injuries or illness, others were working through behavioral issues, and many were simply waiting for their forever homes. Mr. Lee discovered that his experience with street dogs gave him a unique perspective that proved invaluable. He could read their body language in ways that others couldn't, sensing when a dog needed space or when they were ready for more interaction. His patience with scared and aggressive dogs impressed even the most experienced staff members. One morning, he was working with a particularly challenging case, a large dog who had been rescued from an abusive situation and wouldn't let anyone near him. Mr. Lee sat quietly near the dog's kennel, not making eye contact, just talking softly about his own experiences on the street. After several hours, the dog slowly moved closer to the kennel door, showing the first signs of trust he'd displayed since arriving at the center. "How did you do that?" asked one of the younger staff members, amazed at the breakthrough. Mr. Lee smiled gently. "When you've been scared and alone yourself, you learn to recognize it in others. Sometimes all anyone needs is patience and understanding." Lucky's recovery progressed well, and after a week, she was ready to leave the clinic. There was never any question about where she would go. She had already been registered as Mr. Lee's official companion animal. The day they brought her to the rescue center was like a celebration. The staff had prepared a special area in Mr. Lee's apartment for her, complete with a cozy bed and toys. But Mr. Lee hadn't forgotten about his other street dog family. Every morning, before his shift at the rescue center, he would walk to his old spot to help with feeding time. The community volunteers had done an amazing job maintaining the routine, but the dogs still lit up with joy whenever they saw him. Working with Mrs. Zhang and the rescue center staff, they developed a plan for each dog. Patch, being young and friendly, was an easy candidate for adoption. Sunshine, the elderly golden retriever, would do better in a senior dog sanctuary where he could live out his days in comfort. Shadow, the shy black dog, needed more time to trust humans, but showed promise under Mr. Lee's gentle guidance. The transformation in Mr. Lee himself was remarkable. Regular meals, a safe place to sleep, and meaningful work had brought color back to his face and a spring to his step. The constant worry about survival that had aged him beyond his years began to fade. He started taking better care of himself, got needed medical attention, and even began to smile more often. One evening, as he sat in his apartment with Lucky curled up beside him, Mr. Lee looked out his window at the sunset. In the exercise yard below, he could see some of the rescue dogs playing, their barks and playful energy filling the air. On his small table lay training certificates he'd started earning, photographs of successful adoptions he'd helped with, and thank you cards from families who'd adopted dogs he'd worked with. A knock at his door revealed Mrs. Zhang with a surprise. She'd brought dinner and news. The rescue center's board of directors had been so impressed with his work that they wanted to create a new program specifically for helping street dogs, with Mr. Lee as the lead coordinator. As he listened to her outline the proposal, Mr. Lee felt tears welling up in his eyes. Just months ago, he had been invisible to most people, surviving day by day on the streets. Now, not only did he have a home and purpose, but he was being offered the chance to expand his ability to help other animals in need. Lucky pressed against his leg, as if sensing his emotions, and he reached down to scratch behind her ears. "You really were lucky for me, girl," he whispered. "You helped me find my way home." 6 months had passed since Mr. Lee first carried an injured Lucky to the veterinary clinic. The rescue center had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The new street dog program, now officially named Lucky's Legacy, had become a model for other shelters in the city. Every morning, Mr. Lee would wake up early in his apartment, Lucky's tail thumping against the floor as she followed him through his morning routine. His small home had gradually become more personalized. Photos of successfully adopted dogs covered one wall, while certificates from training programs he completed hung on another. A comfortable armchair, donated by Mrs. Kim, sat by the window where he and Lucky would often watch the sunset. The community that had formed around his morning feeding routine hadn't disbanded. Instead, it had grown stronger. What started as one homeless man sharing his food with hungry strays had evolved into a coordinated network of neighborhood volunteers. They now had proper feeding stations set up at various points throughout the city, each monitored by dedicated volunteers. Mr. Chen's bakery had become an unofficial meeting point for the volunteer group. Every morning, people would gather there to collect donations and share updates about the dogs they were helping. The walls of the bakery were covered with before and after photos of dogs who had found homes, many of them thanks to Mr. Lee's program. One particular success story that brought tears to Mr. Lee's eyes was Patch, the playful white puppy with the black eye patch. He had been adopted by Tom, the bus driver, and his family. Now, every morning when Tom drove his route, Patch sat proudly in the front seat of his car on the way home, wearing a proper collar and looking healthy and happy. Sunshine, the elderly golden retriever, was living his best life at a senior dog sanctuary just outside the city. Mr. Lee visited him regularly, bringing special treats and spending hours just sitting with his old friend in the sanctuary's sunny garden. The staff there said Sunshine had become a favorite among visitors, his gentle nature helping other elderly dogs adjust to their new home. Even Shadow, the shy black dog who had taken so long to trust anyone, had made remarkable progress. Under Mr. Lee's patient guidance, he had slowly learned to trust humans again. Now, he worked alongside Mr. Lee at the rescue center, helping to calm other nervous dogs. It turned out Shadow had a special gift for comforting the most frightened newcomers. The rescue center itself had grown. Mrs. Jean had secured additional funding based on the success of Lucky's legacy, allowing them to expand their facilities. They now had a proper medical wing where Dr. Park volunteered her services twice a week. The new wing meant they could help more animals and provide better care for those with special needs. Dr. Rose had started bringing her dental office's staff to volunteer at the center during their free time. They organized regular fundraising events, including a monthly possum bake sale that brought the whole community together. These events not only raised money for the center, but also helped potential adopters meet the dogs in a relaxed, friendly environment. Mr. Lee's role had evolved too. He now led training sessions for other shelters wanting to start similar programs. His gentle approach and first-hand experience made him an excellent teacher. He would share his story openly, helping others understand that compassion could be found in the most unexpected places. "The streets taught me something important," he would often say during these sessions. "When you have nothing left to give but kindness, that kindness can become everything to someone else." Lucky remained by his side through it all, her leg fully healed and her spirit as bright as ever. She had become something of a mascot for the center, greeting visitors with a wagging tail and showing new dogs around as if she owned the place. The sight of her limping up to Mr. Lee that morning so many months ago felt like a distant memory. The local elementary school even invited Mr. Lee to speak to their students about animal care and compassion. He would bring Lucky with him, and together they would teach children about being kind to animals and responsible pet ownership. The children were always fascinated by their story, and several families had ended up adopting dogs from the center after these visits. One particularly memorable day, a city council member visited the center. After spending several hours observing the program in action, she proposed making Lucky's legacy an official city-supported initiative. This would mean more funding and resources to help even more animals in need. As Mr. Lee stood in the rescue center's yard that evening, watching the dogs play in the last rays of sunlight, he felt a deep sense of peace. Lucky sat beside him, her fur glowing golden in the sunset. Around them, the sounds of happy dogs and cheerful volunteers filled the air. Mrs. Jean joined them, holding a fresh cup of coffee. She had learned early on that Mr. Lee preferred his coffee black with just a hint of sugar. "Did you ever imagine this is where feeding one stray dog would lead?" she asked, smiling. Mr. Lee shook his head, reaching down to scratch Lucky's ears. "When you're homeless, you stop imagining futures," he said quietly. "You just try to make it through each day." But Lucky here, she didn't just need food, she needed someone to care. And somehow, by caring for her, I found a whole community of people who cared too. A group of volunteers was leaving for the day, waving goodbye as they passed. Each of them knew Mr. Lee's story, and many had similar stories of how helping animals had changed their own lives. The rescue center had become more than just a place for homeless animals. It was a place where hope was restored, both for the animals and the people who helped them. That night, as Mr. Lee settled into his armchair with Lucky curled up at his feet, he looked at the photo on his wall, the one of him and his street dog family from those early morning feeding sessions. So much had changed since then, but the most important thing remained the same: the power of kindness to transform lives, one small act at a time. "You know what, Lucky?" he said softly, as the dog looked up at him with devoted eyes. "Sometimes the best families are the ones we create ourselves."